My relatives always took my help for granted, so I made them face a bitter consequence. My name is Margaret Hale. For as long as I can remember, my life has been measured by what I could do for others. My relatives called me dependable, but what they really meant was that I was the one they could drain without hesitation. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I grew up believing family was everything. That belief became the foundation of my life, the reason I opened my door, my wallet, and my heart whenever someone needed me. When my sister had her third child and couldn't keep up with expenses, she turned to me. When my nephew failed out of college and needed just a little money to get back on track, I was the first person they called. I suppose part of me let it happen. There was comfort in being needed. I told myself, this is what family is for. This is love expressed in action. But over the years, I started to realize that love wasn't what I was receiving in return. Not once did anyone ask if I was okay. Not once did they pause to wonder whether I might be tired, lonely, or stretched too thin. It wasn't love, they felt it was entitlement. The first time I truly noticed it was at my cousin's wedding. I had given more than I could afford, covering half the reception cost, because she and her new husband wanted a dream start, but couldn't manage the budget. That night, as I stood by the buffet table, I overheard her laughing with her bridesmaids. "Thank God for Aunt Margaret," she said. "She'll die alone with all that money anyway. Better it goes to something fun while she's still around." The words hit me like glass shattering inside my chest. She didn't see me as family. She saw me as a wallet with legs. The truth is, silence became my prison. The more I stayed quiet, the more they took. My home was invaded every holiday with relatives dropping by unannounced and expecting meals as though I were a live-in caterer. They left dirty plates in the sink, shoes scattered across the floor, and laughter that curdled into insults whenever I stepped out of the room. I began to feel like a stranger in my own life. And yet, whenever they called, I still answered. There's a strange psychology in being used. On the surface, it looks like kindness. People say you're generous, dependable, even noble. But underneath it gnaws at you, erodes your sense of worth. I became both proud of my sacrifices and ashamed of them. I lay awake at night wondering, do they love me, or do they love what I give them? And I already knew the answer. The tipping point began quietly with my sister Linda. She showed up at my doorstep one rainy afternoon, her face painted in misery. Her eldest son, the same nephew who had already squandered my help twice now, needed money again. This time, he was starting fresh with a new business idea. "Margaret," she said, gripping my hands as though rehearsing for a play, "he's so close to turning his life around. If you don't help him, he'll be lost forever." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. They were cold, calculating, already assuming my yes. That night, as I sat in the silence of my living room, I looked around at the framed photos of smiling faces, my nieces, nephews, cousins, siblings. All those smiles had been bought with pieces of me. I realized something horrifying. I had built their comfort at the expense of my own dignity, and they didn't even notice. That's when the seed of bitterness was planted. I didn't decide right then to take revenge, not in the sharp, dramatic sense, but I decided to start watching. I decided to stop excusing their behavior as just family. I decided to see them clearly for what they were. It was in that clarity that the first cracks appeared in their perfect facade. At the next gathering, I noticed how quickly my relatives pounced on me the moment I walked in, not to hug me, but to ask what I had brought. I noticed how my name was whispered when bills came due. I noticed how gratitude was never spoken unless it was a weapon to guilt me for more. And beneath my smile, I began to change. A quiet storm gathered inside me, not loud, not violent, but steady and relentless. If they saw me as a resource, then I would let them reveal just how far their greed would stretch. I would become the mirror to their ugliness, because one day when the time was right, I would no longer be their savior. I would be their consequence. The weight of carrying everyone's expectations is invisible until one day it presses so heavily that you can't even breathe. That's how I felt in the months that followed. My phone never stopped buzzing. A cousin needed help covering a car payment. My brother's daughter wanted me to co-sign a loan for graduate school. Even the smallest requests carried the same unspoken message. Of course Margaret will help. She always does. What they never considered was what it cost me, not just financially, but emotionally. I lived with a constant anxiety, a dull ache in my chest every time the phone rang. I knew that behind every cheerful, "Hi, how are you?" was a plea waiting to be delivered. They had turned my love into a currency, and I was the only one paying the price. I had worked my whole life as a schoolteacher, saving bit by bit, clipping coupons, living simply. I wanted to ensure that in retirement I could live without burdening anyone else. That dream was slipping through my fingers with every check I wrote. My savings dwindled, my sense of security eroded, and yet I kept giving because the alternative was being labeled selfish. But what tore at me more than money was the loneliness. I wasn't married. I didn't have children of my own. My family should have been my anchor, the people who made sure I never felt invisible. Instead, I was surrounded by them constantly and still felt utterly alone. They didn't come to sit with me on a quiet evening or to ask about my health or to celebrate the small victories of my life. They only came with needs. The cruelest irony was that they seemed to believe they were entitled to my sacrifices. I remember once, after bailing out my nephew from another ill-fated job loss, I hinted to my sister Linda that I was struggling to keep up with my own expenses. She laughed as if I had told a joke. "Oh, Margaret," she said, "you've always been good with money. You'll be fine. Besides, you don't have kids. You don't have to worry like the rest of us." That sentence cut like a knife, as though not having children meant I owed my entire life to theirs, as though every choice I had made, every careful plan was less valuable than their endless mistakes. The truth was, I was beginning to feel like a shadow in my own life. I kept asking myself, if I disappeared tomorrow, would they even notice? Or would they only care about what they could no longer take? The breaking point didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, a tide rising higher and higher. It was in the way my niece dropped her kids off at my house, without asking, leaving me to babysit for entire weekends. It was in the way my cousin asked to borrow my car and returned it with an empty tank and a new dent, shrugging it off like it was nothing. It was in the way they stopped saying thank you altogether, replacing it with casual commands. "You'll cover this, won't you?" Every incident added another stone to the burden I carried until my shoulders were bent under the invisible weight. But the moment that tipped me from weariness into resolve came on a quiet Tuesday evening. My nephew, the one with the endless fresh starts, showed up at my door. He didn't even bother with pleasantries this time. He walked right in, sat on my couch, and announced that he had lost the money I had given him in yet another failed business attempt. Then, without a shred of shame, he said, "I'll need more to keep this afloat." "You wouldn't want me to fail again, would you?" Something inside me snapped. I remember staring at him, at his easy grin, at the way he sprawled across my furniture as if my home belonged to him. For the first time in years, I didn't see family, I saw a leech. And I saw myself pale and exhausted, drained dry by decades of enabling. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply stood and said, "You need to leave." The look on his face was almost comical, pure disbelief. "What, you're joking, Aunt Margaret?" "I'm not," I said, my voice steady. "You need to leave. And don't come back until you've learned what it means to stand on your own." He stormed out, muttering insults under his breath. But when the door shut, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't heavy. It was freeing. For the first time, I had drawn a line. Of course, the fallout was immediate. Within days, Linda called me in tears, accusing me of abandoning her son. Other relatives chimed in, whispering that I had changed, that I was becoming bitter, selfish, cold. But their words, once capable of breaking me, now slid off like rain on glass. Because the truth was, they were right, I had changed. And I needed to. That week, I began to examine my life with new eyes. I walked through my home, noticing the little things that belonged more to them than to me, the toys left behind the clothes, forgotten the receipts from dinners I had paid for. I realized my life had been colonized by their needs, leaving no room for my own. I started small. I stopped answering every call. I said no to weekend babysitting. I cooked dinner for myself without worrying if there would be enough for unexpected guests. These small refusals felt like breaths of fresh air, tiny victories reclaiming the life I had almost forgotten was mine. But each no I gave was met with anger. Relatives who had once smiled in my presence now frowned. They accused me of being ungrateful, of forgetting all the joy they had brought me. They tried to guilt me back into submission, reminding me of family loyalty, of blood ties that couldn't be severed. And yet the more they pushed, the clearer it became. They had never loved me for who I was. They had loved me for what I gave. This realization was both devastating and liberating. I grieved for the family I thought I had, the warm embrace of people who cared for me, the imagined love I believed was mutual. But in that grief, I also found clarity. If they only valued me as a resource, then perhaps it was time to stop being one. It was during one of these late-night reflections that the idea first sparked, not fully formed, but a whisper. What if I let them face the consequences of their own greed? The thought both frightened and thrilled me. All my life, I had been the safety net. If I stepped away, if I let them fall, what would happen? Would they learn? Would they break? I didn't know. But I did know one thing: I couldn't keep carrying them any longer. The weight was killing me. And if I didn't put it down now, I would disappear under it completely. That night, I stood in front of the mirror studying the lines of my face. I saw the tiredness etched in my eyes, the softness that had been mistaken for weakness. And I whispered to my reflection, "No more." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a vow shouted into the void. It was quiet, steady, and absolute. A line had been drawn. And once drawn, I knew I would never step back over it again. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that the weight I carried didn't belong to me. It belonged to them. And it was time they carried it themselves. It's strange how quickly people reveal their true colors when you stop giving them what they want. At first, when I began saying no, my relatives thought it was a temporary mood. They assumed I was having a bad week or being difficult, and that soon enough, I'd return to my old compliant self. But when my refusals became consistent, the atmosphere around me shifted, and not in subtle ways. The first real test came during a Sunday family gathering at my house. For years, my home had been the designated meeting place, not because I volunteered, but because it was convenient for everyone else. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and my living room was spacious enough to host 20 people. Over time, it became a given: holidays, birthdays, casual Sunday dinners, always at Margaret's, always on my dime. That day, they arrived in their usual swarm, carrying nothing but empty hands and loud voices. I had deliberately chosen not to prepare a feast, only a modest meal for myself. I wanted to see what they would do if the table wasn't magically set for them. My niece was the first to notice. She walked into the kitchen, frowned at the sight of a single casserole dish cooling on the counter, and said, "Aunt Margaret, is this it? What are we all supposed to eat?" I calmly replied, "I only cooked for myself today. I wasn't aware we'd be having a party." The look she gave me, half disbelief, half insult, burned into my memory. "Well, we always come here," she said. "You know that. Why didn't you prepare like usual?" "Because no one asked," I said, my voice level. "And because it's not my responsibility to feed a dozen grown adults every weekend." Her silence stretched, her eyes narrowing before she stormed off to complain to the others. Within minutes, the murmurs began. I heard whispers in the living room. "She's acting strange. What's gotten into her?" Maybe she's losing it. But the whispers turned into open disrespect when my cousin, emboldened by the group, raised his voice. Margaret, you've changed. You used to love hosting us. What happened? Are you really that selfish now? I looked around at the faces staring back at me, faces I had fed, clothed, and supported in more ways than I could count. Not one of them offered to bring food. Not one offered to take turns hosting. They didn't want family togetherness, they wanted free meals, a free space, free everything. And in that moment I saw the truth. They had mistaken my kindness for obligation. They had twisted love into servitude. Still, I didn't shout. I simply said, if being family means I must provide everything while you contribute nothing, then perhaps you've misunderstood the word. The room went cold. Some of them scoffed, others rolled their eyes, and a few muttered that I was bitter. Then, one by one, they left. No hugs, no goodbyes, just slammed doors and muttered curses as they filed out. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, I stood in the silence of my house and realized just how empty their love had been. Not one of them had thanked me in all those years, but the first time I stopped giving, they turned on me like wolves. From then on, the disrespect grew sharper. They no longer pretended to be grateful. When they did visit, they treated my home as though it were theirs to command. My niece once brought her children over unannounced, dumped them in my living room, and said she'd be back in a few hours. She didn't ask. She didn't even look me in the eye. I decided to test her. I'm sorry, I said, standing at the door. I can't watch them today. I have plans. She froze, clearly unprepared for refusal. But you always do it, she argued. Not today, I repeated, stepping aside. You'll have to manage. Her face contorted with anger as she dragged her children back to the car, muttering, "You're unbelievable. Unbelievable because I dared to live my own life." But the most humiliating moment came at a family dinner hosted by my brother Daniel. It was one of the rare times we weren't at my house. I had been quietly proud of him for taking responsibility for once in bringing everyone together. That pride quickly soured when halfway through the meal he raised a glass and made a toast. To Margaret, he said with a smirk, for finally taking a break from being our servant. Who knew she had it in her? The table erupted in laughter, cruel, mocking laughter. I sat frozen, the blood draining from my face. They weren't just using me, they were ridiculing me for it. In their eyes, I was a fool, someone too spineless to stand up for myself until now. And even then, they found a way to twist it into a joke. That night, I drove home with tears stinging my eyes, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Their laughter echoed in my ears sharper than any insult. They had stripped me of dignity in a room full of people I had devoted my life to supporting. But beneath the humiliation, something else was rising, something stronger than pain. Rage. Not the wild, screaming rage of someone who wants to lash out, but the cold, steady burn of someone who knows she has been wronged too many times. I realized that my silence had allowed this. My endless giving, my refusal to demand respect had built this monster of entitlement. They weren't going to stop, not unless I forced them to. From that night onward, my perspective shifted. Every time they disrespected me in my own home, every time they laughed behind my back, every time they treated me as less than human, it only strengthened my resolve. Because if they thought I would remain their servant forever, they were wrong. I had endured enough. And slowly, quietly, I began to plot, not for revenge in the form of shouting matches or dramatic scenes, but for something deeper, something they could never laugh away. I would make them face the truth of who they had become. I would hold up a mirror so sharp it cut them. And when that day came, they would finally understand that the woman they dismissed as weak had been watching, waiting, and preparing all along. Have you ever been in a situation like this? If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. The night that changed everything began like so many others, another family gathering, another excuse for them to fill their bellies and empty my wallet. I had almost convinced myself to stay home to avoid the headache, but a sense of obligation tugged at me. Daniel, my brother, had called earlier in the week, insisting I come. "It won't be the same without you," he said in that falsely affectionate tone he used whenever he wanted something. I arrived carrying a modest dish of roasted vegetables, the only thing I could afford that week, without straining my budget. When I walked into Daniel's house, the smell of grilled meat and expensive wine hit me. The room was alive with laughter and chatter. For a brief moment, I felt like maybe this time would be different. Maybe they had grown up, learned to respect what I had given. That hope vanished within minutes. My sister Linda was the first to strike. She eyed my small dish, then laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Margaret, darling, is that it, vegetables? Honestly, you know we count on you for more than that. Where's the roast? Where's the dessert? You usually go all out." The room chuckled. My cheeks burned. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words tangled in my throat. I wanted to tell her that I had nothing left to give, that every penny I saved was a battle, that I was tired. Instead, I forced a smile and set the dish down on the crowded table, surrounded by platters of food I hadn't been asked to contribute to. As the evening wore on, the comments became sharper, their entitlement bolder. My nephew bragged about a new gadget he'd bought with money I knew had once come from my checks. My cousin's wife leaned over and whispered, "It's such a blessing Margaret doesn't have kids of her own. Imagine how much less she'd have to help us all." Each word landed like a blow. I sat quietly, sipping water, trying to control the storm rising inside me. But the last straw came after dinner, when the bill for the catering service arrived. Daniel, in his usual smug way, slid the receipt across the table toward me. "You've always been the generous one, Margaret. Why don't you cover this? Consider it your contribution to keeping the family together." The room went silent, all eyes on me, waiting for the familiar nod of agreement. But this time I didn't nod. I stared at the bill, my heart pounding in my chest. It was nearly $1,000, an amount that would gut what little I had left in my account. The silence stretched as I lifted my eyes and looked at each face around the table. Faces that had smiled when I gave that, had mocked when I faltered, that now waited for me to sacrifice once again. "No," I said, my voice steady. The word was so small, but it carried the weight of years. Daniel laughed, thinking I was joking. "Come on, Margaret, don't be difficult. We all know you can afford it." I said no, this time louder, firmer. My hands trembled, but my gaze didn't waver. The silence that followed was different from before, heavy, stunned. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing their game. Linda broke it first, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You can't be serious. After everything we've done for you." My laughter cut her off, bitter and sharp. "Everything you've done for me." "What exactly is that, Linda? Remind me, because all I remember is what I've done for you, for all of you. Every loan, every bill, every meal, every sacrifice. Tell me, when was the last time any of you gave me anything?" Their eyes darted away. No one spoke. The silence was answer enough. I stood, my legs shaking, but my spine straighter than it had ever been. "I am not your bank. I am not your servant. If this family means so much to you, then you can start contributing yourselves. Don't ever slide a bill across the table to me again." Daniel's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to us like this? We're your family?" "Yes," I said, my voice icy. "You are? And that should mean something more than using me until there's nothing left." For a moment, I thought someone might apologize, that maybe my words had pierced through the armor of their entitlement. But instead, the room erupted into chaos. My relatives shouted, accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, even cruel. Linda sneered, "You'll regret this, Margaret. Family is all you have. Push us away and you'll die alone." The words stung, but not in the way she intended. They stung because I realized she truly believed them, that without their constant presence, my life would be meaningless. But I knew better now. Their presence wasn't love. It was poison. I left without another word, my dish of vegetables still untouched on the table. As I walked to my car, the night air cool against my skin, I felt something inside me shift. The humiliation of their mockery, the fury of their entitlement. it no longer crushed me. It fueled me. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, and whispered to myself, enough. For decades I had given them everything, and they had given me nothing but scorn. That night something broke inside me, but it was not my spirit. It was the chains they had wrapped around me, the invisible bonds of guilt and obligation. From that night forward, I knew I couldn't just withdraw quietly. That would only invite them back with sharper claws and louder demands. No, I needed to do more. I needed to show them, force them to see the truth of what they had become. And so, as the laughter and accusations from the house echoed faintly behind me, I made a decision. If they thought I was weak, they would soon learn how strong I could be. If they thought I would always carry their burdens, they would soon feel the weight themselves. Because I was done playing their savior. It was time for them to face a bitter consequence. The morning after that explosive dinner at Daniel's, I woke up with a strange clarity. My body felt heavy with the weight of years, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I had said no. For the first time, I had refused to be their safety net. And though their words of scorn still echoed in my head, I realized I had survived it. I wasn't shattered. I wasn't abandoned. I was still here, and stronger for it. But I also knew my relatives wouldn't give up easily. They had grown too used to my compliance, too dependent on my sacrifices. So I decided to take a different approach. Instead of a loud battle, I would retreat into silence. No confrontations, no explanations, just absence. A quiet withdrawal that would force them to reveal their true selves. It began with the phone calls. My sister Linda called 3 times in 1 week, each time with the same shrill urgency. Margaret, I need a loan. Just a small one. I'll pay you back, I promise. I let the phone ring. I didn't answer. She left messages that grew more desperate than angrier. I don't know what's gotten into you. You think you're better than us? You think you can just turn your back on family? Each message was proof that my silence was working. For years I had believed their voices were chains I couldn't break. Now, by simply not answering, I felt those chains loosening. Next came my nephew. He showed up at my house unannounced, pounding on the door, shouting my name like I was hiding from him. I stood in the kitchen, my heart pounding, watching him through the lace curtains. His face was red with frustration. Finally, after 10 minutes, he shouted, "Fine, don't answer. But when I'm rich, don't expect me to share anything with you." I almost laughed. When he's rich, he had been chasing quick schemes his entire adult life, each one ending in disaster. Yet here he was, still expecting me to fund his fantasies. I didn't open the door. And as his footsteps stomped away, I felt another small piece of freedom settle over me. But the quiet withdrawal wasn't just about refusing money. It was about reclaiming my home, my space, my dignity. For too long, my house had been an open inn, a revolving door for relatives who treated it like their personal clubhouse. So I stopped answering the door when they dropped by uninvited. I stopped cooking extra food, stopped keeping a spare bed ready. My home was mine again, and I guarded it fiercely. At first, they didn't believe it. They thought I was sulking, that I'd eventually give in. So they escalated. One Sunday, Linda arrived with her grandchildren bags in hand, ready for me to babysit. I opened the door just enough to look her in the eye and said, "I'm not available today." Her jaw dropped. "What do you mean? Not available? They're your family." "Yes," I said calmly, "and they're your responsibility." Then I shut the door. The banging and shouting that followed shook the walls, but I didn't budge. I sat in my chair reading a book, pretending I couldn't hear her rage. After 15 minutes, she left in a storm, dragging the children behind her. Word spread quickly through the family grapevine. Margaret wasn't playing her role anymore. Margaret was refusing. Margaret was changing. And with every refusal, their smiles vanished, replaced with frowns, whispers, and open resentment. I overheard it one evening when I stopped by the grocery store. My cousin and her friend were in the next aisle, unaware I was within earshot. "Margaret's gone cold," she said. "She's not helping anyone anymore. Honestly, she's turning into a bitter old woman." Her friend clucked sympathetically. Well, maybe she finally realized you all were using her. The silence that followed was delicious. For once, someone outside the family had named the truth. Still, the gossip grew. They painted me as selfish, ungrateful, even cruel. After everything we've done for her, Linda wailed to anyone who would listen. But I couldn't help wondering what had they done for me exactly. My mind came up empty. The more they complained, the lighter I felt. Each accusation only proved how much they had depended on my compliance and how powerless they felt without it. Yet despite the freedom, there was pain too. These were my relatives, my blood. I had spent years believing we were bound by love. To watch them turn on me so quickly, to see their smiles replaced with sneers, was like grieving a death. I mourned not just for what they were, but for the illusion I had held onto for so long. But grief has a way of hardening into resolve. And I knew my withdrawal was only the beginning. If I truly wanted them to understand, to face the bitter consequence of their greed, I would have to go further. It was around this time that I began keeping notes. Not out of pettiness, but out of clarity. Every request they made, every insult they hurled, every time they twisted the word family into a weapon, I wrote it down. Page after page filled with their entitlement, their disrespect, their manipulation. And as I read back over those pages, I realized something: I wasn't crazy. For years, they had gaslit me into believing I was selfish whenever I resisted. But the evidence in my own handwriting proved the truth. My quiet withdrawal wasn't just about saying no, it was about seeing clearly, about documenting the reality they tried to hide beneath fake smiles and empty hugs. The next time Linda called, I picked up. Her voice was sharp, demanding. "Margaret, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this needs to stop. We're family. You can't just shut us out." I listened quietly, then said, "I'm not shutting you out. I'm choosing myself." She sputtered in disbelief. "Yourself? What about us?" "What about me?" I asked. "Have you ever once thought about what I need? What I want? Or have you only thought about what you can take?" Her silence spoke louder than any argument. I hung up before she could recover. In the days that followed, I felt both terrified and exhilarated. Terrified of their anger, of the inevitable backlash, but exhilarated by the taste of freedom. I had lived so long under their shadow that even the smallest act of defiance felt like sunlight on my skin, and I knew I wasn't done. Because my withdrawal was only stage 1. Stage 2 would be watching, observing how they squirmed without me, how quickly their world fell apart when I stopped holding it together. They thought they could shame me back into submission, but they were about to learn a lesson I had waited far too long to teach. That taking someone for granted comes with a price, and I was ready to make sure they paid it. I had always believed gossip was something that belonged to high school hallways, the whispered drama of teenagers. I never thought I'd live long enough to hear my own name passed around like a rumor at church, dissected by the very people I had fed, clothed, and bailed out of crisis more times than I could count. But once I withdrew my help, once I stopped being their bottomless well of sacrifice, my relatives sharpened their tongues like knives. It began subtly. A neighbor stopped me on my morning walk, tilting her head with that half-pitying, half-intrigued look that people get when they're hungry for gossip. "Margaret," she said, "I heard you've been keeping to yourself. Everything all right?" I smiled politely, but inside I froze. Keeping to myself was code. It meant Linda had been talking. Within days, the whispers grew louder. I overheard it in the grocery store, in the post office, even in the pew behind me at Sunday service. "She used to be so generous," someone whispered. "Now she's bitter." Another added, "Linda said she's lost her mind, refusing to help her own family." Each time my stomach twisted. It was one thing to face their entitlement directly, another to hear my reputation, the only thing I had ever tried to protect, dragged through the mud. My relatives weren't just disappointed in me. They were rewriting me into a villain, a cautionary tale. But instead of breaking me, the gossip confirmed what I had already begun to suspect: they didn't love me. They needed me. And now that I had taken away what they wanted, they needed to destroy me to justify their resentment. The cruelest rumor came from Daniel. He had told distant relatives, and apparently anyone who would listen, that I was hoarding my money out of spite. "Margaret's selfish," he declared. "She's sitting on savings while the rest of us struggle. She doesn't care if her nieces and nephews starve." The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud when I first heard it. Starve. These were people who lived in nicer houses than mine, who wore expensive clothes, who went on vacations while I stretched my pension to cover their emergencies. But Daniel was clever. He knew people loved a villain, and he cast me perfectly for the role. Soon enough, I became the subject of hushed conversations. In their narrative, I was no longer the dependable aunt, the reliable sister. I was the stingy old woman, bitter and selfish, turning her back on family values. The sting of betrayal was sharper than I expected. I had always told myself that even if they used me, at least they respected me. At least they saw me as good. But their gossip proved otherwise. They had never seen me as good, they had seen me as useful. And when usefulness disappeared, so did respect. I began to notice the shift in how people looked at me. Neighbors who once waved warmly now offered strained smiles. Church acquaintances who used to sit beside me at coffee hour now avoided eye contact. The smear campaign was working. My relatives weren't just punishing me privately, they were erasing me publicly. It hurt. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. But it also fueled something in me I hadn't felt in years: determination. If they thought they could destroy me with lies, then they underestimated me. Because while they wasted their breath gossiping, I was watching. I was taking notes. I was preparing. I started showing up at family events not as the provider, not as the servant, but as a silent observer. I no longer brought lavish dishes or opened my wallet. I sat quietly sipping water, listening to the conversations swirl around me. And every time someone whispered something cruel, I made a mental note. I noticed the cracks forming without my help. Linda's son had dropped out of another business venture, leaving her scrambling to cover his debts. Daniel's wife complained openly about overdue bills. My niece, who had once relied on me for babysitting, looked exhausted and frazzled from juggling her own children. For the first time, I realized how fragile their lives were without me holding them together. And instead of pity, I felt something unexpected: vindication. One evening after church, I overheard two women whispering about me in the parking lot. "Margaret's so cold now," one said. "Imagine refusing your own nephew." I walked straight up to them, my heart pounding, and said calmly, "I imagine he's 30 years old. Old enough to take care of himself, don't you think?" The way their mouths fell open was almost comical. For once, I didn't slink away from the gossip. I pierced it with truth. But the real shift came when I stopped trying to defend myself at all. I realized something important. Gossip only has power if you chase it, if you try to explain, to justify, to win people back. I didn't need to win anyone back. Their whispers were proof of who they were, not who I was. And so I leaned into silence again, but this time not as retreat, but as strength. Let them talk. Let them paint me as the villain. I knew the truth, and soon so would everyone else. Because the more they gossiped, the more desperate they revealed themselves to be. Their stories grew wilder, more exaggerated. Margaret slammed the door on her crying niece. Margaret laughed when her nephew begged for help. Lies spun into webs tangled and flimsy. And the more outrageous they became, the more others began to question them. One Sunday, my pastor approached me quietly. "Margaret," he said, "I don't know what's happening in your family, but I want you to know your worth isn't measured by what others take from you. Sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do." His words sank deep into me. For the first time in months, I felt seen, validated. Maybe I wasn't selfish. Maybe I was finally being wise. And that's when the idea crystallized. Gossip had exposed the truth: my family cared more about what I provided than who I was. So why not use that? Why not let their greed, their lies, their entitlement lead them into the very trap they were so desperate to avoid? I didn't need to confront every rumor. I didn't need to argue. I only needed to give them an opportunity, a stage where their hypocrisy could reveal itself. Because if they were so eager to talk about me behind my back, then soon I'd make sure everyone was watching when the mask slipped from their faces. The seed of an idea had been growing in my mind ever since the gossip started. My relatives thought they were clever, thought they could twist my reputation into whatever shape suited their needs. But the more they talked, the more careless they became, and the easier it became to predict their behavior. I knew one thing about them for certain: they would always chase the scent of money. So if I wanted to show them who they really were, all I needed to do was let them think there was something to gain. It began with small gestures subtle enough not to arouse suspicion. I dropped hints in conversation about reorganizing my finances, about figuring out what to do with my savings. I let the words fall casually as if they were nothing, and then I watched their eyes sharpen with interest. It was like dangling meat in front of wolves. At a family brunch, I mentioned offhandedly, "I've been meeting with my lawyer about estate planning. It's overwhelming deciding where everything should go." The effect was immediate. Linda's fork clattered against her plate. Daniel leaned forward, suddenly attentive. My niece plastered on a smile so wide it nearly split her face. "Estate planning, Aunt Margaret?" she asked sweetly. "That sounds so responsible. Do you need any help? You know we're always here for you." I nearly laughed at the transparency. Always here for me so long as there was the promise of inheriting what they hadn't earned. Over the next few weeks, I fed them just enough information to keep their greed alive. I spoke vaguely of investments, of savings accounts, of important decisions I'd have to make soon. I never gave specifics, never confirmed the size of what I had. The less I said, the wilder their imaginations ran. And then, when the bait was firmly set, I planned the trap. I invited them all to dinner at my house, an unusual move, given my recent withdrawals. The invitation alone sent ripples through the family. They showed up dressed better than usual, faces scrubbed with forced politeness, their laughter too bright, their compliments too thick. "Aunt Margaret, you look wonderful," my niece gushed, kissing my cheek. "I can't believe how cozy your house is," Daniel added, as if he hadn't mocked me for years about living like a spinster. The hypocrisy was almost unbearable, but I smiled politely, pouring drinks, serving food, letting them bask in the illusion that things were going back to normal. Once everyone had eaten, I cleared my throat. The room quieted instantly, their eyes shining with barely contained curiosity. They were waiting for me to say the words they craved. "I've decided to leave everything to you. I wanted to share something important with you while I began. As you know, I've been getting older, and I've been thinking a lot about the future." Linda clasped her hands dramatically. "Oh, Margaret, don't talk like that. You have so many good years left." I nodded solemnly, hiding the smirk tugging at my lips. "Still, it's wise to prepare, so I've been working on my estate plans." The air thickened with anticipation. My nephew leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eagerness practically dripping. "That's very smart, Aunt Margaret. Have you decided what you'll do with everything?" I let the silence stretch, savoring their hunger. "Not yet. I want to make sure my assets go to the people who truly deserve them, the people who value me, not just what I can give." The shift in the room was subtle but electric. Their smiles froze. Their eyes darted, calculating. I had just turned the game on them. To drive the point further, I added, "Over the next few months, I'll be watching. I want to see who really shows up for me, not for what I have, but for who I am." It was almost comical the way their behavior changed overnight. Suddenly, my phone rang more often, not with demands, but with syrupy check-ins. "How are you feeling today, Aunt Margaret? Do you need anything from the store? I was just thinking about you." At first, it was almost laughable. These were the same people who had mocked me, dismissed me, and left me out of conversations when I stopped paying their bills. Now they were tripping over themselves to play the role of loving family. But I knew the truth, it wasn't love driving them. It was greed. My nephew even showed up one afternoon with flowers, a cheap bouquet from the grocery store. Just because he said, forcing a smile, I accepted them with a gracious nod, all the while imagining him calculating how many zeros my bank account might hold. The gossip that had once painted me as selfish transformed into praise. "Margaret's really turned things around," Linda said loudly at a church gathering, making sure everyone could hear. "She's been so thoughtful lately. We're all very close." The hypocrisy was staggering. I let them play their parts. Let them think they were fooling me. But all the while, I documented every word, every action. My notebook grew thicker, filled with proof of their duplicity. Because when the time came, I wanted no doubts left about who they truly were. And as I watched them scramble, competing with each other for my attention, I felt a strange sense of power. For years, I had been the one begging for scraps of love, clinging to the illusion that family meant care. Now the roles were reversed. They were the ones begging, except they weren't begging for me. They were begging for what they thought they could take when I was gone. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't begin to imagine, was that I had no intention of rewarding their greed. The trap was working. Their true selves were bubbling to the surface, uglier than ever. And soon, very soon, I would spring it. Because there's nothing more satisfying than watching people expose themselves, especially when all you've done is give them the chance to do exactly that. Once the bait had been dangled, my relatives became predictable in the most astonishing ways. They couldn't hide their desperation, not even behind the thin masks of politeness they'd hurriedly stitched together for my benefit. Suddenly, I was the center of attention, though not in the way I had ever wanted. Their voices grew sweeter, their hands lighter when they touched my arm, their eyes hungrier each time they glanced at me. It started small, almost comical. Linda began calling every morning without fail. "Good morning, Margaret." She'd chirp, her voice unnaturally bright. "Did you sleep well? Have you eaten breakfast? I could bring you some muffins." Muffins. From Linda. This was the same sister who once dropped off her kids without warning and left me scrambling to feed them peanut butter sandwiches because she hadn't bothered to pack a meal. Now she was suddenly concerned about my diet. I politely declined, but I could hear the edge of irritation creep into her voice when I didn't gush with gratitude. Daniel took another route. He started offering to do small repairs around my house, repairs he'd ignored for years. One afternoon, he showed up with a toolbox, uninvited as usual, and insisted on fixing a squeaky hinge on the back door. He whistled while he worked, loud and cheerful, as though I should be impressed by his sudden helpfulness. "There you go, Margaret," he said, dusting off his hands. "Good as new. You know you really shouldn't be living alone. Someone could take advantage of you." I met his gaze and smiled faintly. "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing." His grin faltered for a moment before returning, too wide, too forced. But the most telling transformation came from my nephew, the one who had drained me of thousands of dollars chasing failed dreams. He began hovering around me like a shadow. Calling, texting, showing up at church when he hadn't set foot there in years. Once he even appeared on my porch with groceries. "Thought I'd help out Aunt Margaret," he said, puffing out his chest. "You've always been there for me. Time I return the favor." The groceries were laughable, cheap, off-brand items I didn't need, chosen more for show than substance. But I accepted them with a nod, and his eyes gleamed as if he'd just secured his place at the top of my non-existent inheritance list. Watching their desperation would have been amusing if it hadn't been so tragic. Here were grown adults, people with careers, families, lives of their own, scrambling like children for candy, all because they thought my savings might someday fall into their hands. They weren't competing for me. They were competing for what I represented: money, security, advantage. And the more they tried to outdo each other, the more obvious it became. I began to notice the subtle barbs they exchanged. At a Sunday lunch, Linda brought a pie she'd clearly purchased from the store, though she passed it off as homemade. "I thought Margaret might like something sweet," she said loudly. Daniel smirked. "Funny, Linda. You never baked for her before? Seems a bit opportunistic." Her eyes flashed. "At least I'm trying. What have you done for her lately? They turned to me, waiting for me to declare a winner like children in a schoolyard spat. I merely sipped my tea, letting the silence answer for me. Their desperation grew more elaborate as weeks passed. My niece invited me to dinner at her house, something she'd never done in her life. She spent the entire evening parading her children in front of me as if their laughter and hugs would melt my heart into promising her everything. Aunt Margaret, she whispered conspiratorially as she served dessert. You've always been like a second mother to me. I don't know what I'd do without you. I smiled, my eyes steady on hers. And yet, you never thought to invite me here before. Interesting, isn't it? Her cheeks flushed crimson. What fascinated me most was how quickly their masks slipped when they thought I wasn't watching. At one gathering, I overheard Linda snapping at Daniel in the kitchen. She's not going to leave it all to you, Linda hissed. Don't think fixing a few hinges makes you special. Daniel's voice was low but sharp. Better than showing up with muffins. She'll see right through you. The hypocrisy, the competition, the sudden scramble to outshine one another. It was like watching a play where every actor forgot their lines but refused to leave the stage. And through it all, I sat quietly, taking notes, smiling politely, letting them believe they were fooling me. But beneath my calm exterior, I felt something shift. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being manipulated. I was in control. They were dancing to a tune they thought they were composing when in reality I had written every note. Still, there were moments that cut deeper than I expected. One afternoon, I overheard Linda talking to her daughter. Don't worry, honey. Aunt Margaret won't live forever. When the time comes, we'll make sure you get what's yours. What's yours? The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. I wasn't even a person in their eyes anymore. I was a vault, a collection of numbers waiting to be unlocked by my death. For a moment, grief washed over me, grief for the family I thought I had, for the love I had convinced myself was real. But grief quickly hardened into steel. Because if they thought they could reduce me to a prize to be fought over, then they were in for a lesson they'd never forget. Their desperation was exposing them more efficiently than I ever could. The trap was working better than I imagined, and soon it would be time to pull the final thread. Because watching them scramble was satisfying, yes, but watching them crumble under the weight of their own greed would be the true victory. The night of the reveal was one I had been preparing for silently, patiently, almost like a chess player waiting to declare checkmate. My relatives thought they were circling closer to a prize. They had no idea they were standing on a stage I had carefully built, their own greed the spotlight that illuminated them. I chose a Sunday dinner as the moment. They all expected me to host again eventually, and by sending out warm invitations, I fed their assumptions that I was coming back around. Of course, they accepted without hesitation, every one of them dressed to impress, arriving with false smiles and carefully practiced charm. Linda arrived first, holding a basket of fruit. She had never in her life brought food to my house without expecting me to provide the feast. For you, Margaret, she said with exaggerated sweetness. I thought you might like something fresh. Daniel followed, arms wide, his voice booming with fake joviality. Sister, it's been too long. We've missed you. One by one, they filed in, nephews, nieces, cousins, each trying to outdo the others in their performance of affection. If I hadn't known better, I might have been fooled. But I did know better. And tonight, I was going to let them know it too. The table was set modestly but neatly. I made sure to serve enough food for everyone, not to appease them, but to keep them sitting long enough for me to say what needed to be said. Conversation started light, though tense. They asked about my health, about whether I'd been getting enough rest, about if I needed anything. Each question carried an undertone I could hear clearly. Do you need someone to take care of your money yet? I let them talk, let them warm themselves up in their false concern. And then, when the plates were half empty and the wine had loosened their tongues, I leaned back in my chair and set my fork down. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few months, I said softly. The room stilled. They knew what was coming, they thought they did anyway. Eyes flicked to one another, anticipation humming like electricity. I've been thinking about my life, about what family means, About what love really looks like. Linda smiled too quickly. Of course, Margaret. And you know we all love you so much. Do you? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. The word sliced through the room like a knife. Because when I look back, I don't see love. I see demands. I see expectations. I see years of being used. The silence that followed was deafening. Their eyes widened, mouths opening and closing like fish. For once, none of them had a script prepared. Daniel cleared his throat. Now, Margaret? That's not fair. Not fair, I snapped. Do you want to hear what's not fair? It's not fair that I spent my retirement feeding and housing you all while you laughed at me behind my back. It's not fair that when I stopped paying, you started gossiping, calling me selfish, bitter, even crazy. Do you think I don't know what you've said? The color drained from Linda's face. My nephew shifted uncomfortably in his chair. No one dared to speak. I have notes. I continued, my voice steadier, now colder. Every insult, every rumor, every time one of you showed up at my door with your hands out. I kept track. I listened. I watched. And do you know what I realized? I leaned forward, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. None of you love me. You love what I can give you. A ripple of protest rose, but I held up my hand. Don't. Don't you dare deny it. Because when I stopped giving, you turned on me like wolves. Family, you call yourselves, no. Family doesn't devour one of their own. Family doesn't laugh when their sister is humiliated at her own brother's table. Family doesn't gossip that she'll die soon and we'll get what's ours. Gasps broke out around the table. Faces paled, jaws clenched. Some tried to mask their guilt with outrage. Margaret, you misunderstood, Linda stammered. No, I cut her off. I understood perfectly. You've all made it abundantly clear. And now I want you to understand something. I let the silence hang, let their fear build. My heart pounded, but my voice didn't waver. I will not be your servant anymore. I will not be your wallet. And when the time comes to divide what I leave behind, it will not go to those who treated me like a burden until they thought they could profit from me. The words struck like stones in water, rippling across their faces. Linda's mouth opened and shut, her cheeks flushed crimson. Daniel's fists clenched on the table. My nephew looked as though someone had just stolen his future out from under him. I smiled faintly. So here we are. I know the truth. And now, so do you. I leaned back, folded my hands, and let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then I asked quietly, how do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? The question hung in the air like smoke. None of them spoke. None of them moved. For once in their lives, they were forced to look at themselves through my eyes, and what they saw was ugly. And I savored the moment. Because this was only the beginning. The days following that Sunday dinner felt eerily calm, almost like the stillness after a storm has passed. But before you realize, another one is brewing on the horizon. My relatives had left my house that night in stunned silence, their faces pale, their mouths tight with words they couldn't form. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the truth had finally cut through their entitlement. That perhaps my words had pierced their greed and left behind some shard of self-awareness. But I was wrong. Instead of reflection, they turned to retaliation. When people are used to feeding on someone, when their comfort relies on another person's sacrifice, they don't accept the withdrawal of that sacrifice quietly. They lash out. And my family was no exception. It began with Linda, as it always did. She called the very next morning, her voice brittle with a false calm. Margaret, I think we need to talk about what happened last night. You were emotional. You must have misunderstood some things. I sat in my chair, the phone warm against my ear, and let her talk. She rambled about family loyalty and how everyone has said things they don't mean. Then her tone shifted sharp with accusation. You embarrassed us, Margaret. Do you understand? You made us feel like beggars. That wasn't fair. Her words almost made me laugh. I had made them feel like beggars, as though I had invented their constant demands, their greed, their manipulation. No, they had done that themselves. I had simply held up the mirror. "I didn't make you beg," I said calmly. "You did that all on your own." She sputtered, then raised her voice. "You're cruel, Margaret. After everything we've done for you." I cut her off with a low laugh. "And what exactly have you done for me?" Linda lists one thing. Silence. Long, heavy silence. Then the line went dead. I thought that would be the end of it, but it was only the beginning. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at my doorstep. He didn't knock politely. He pounded his fists, rattling the door, his voice booming through the wood. "Margaret, open this door right now." When I finally opened it, he stormed in without waiting for an invitation, his face red with fury. "What the hell was that the other night? Do you have any idea how selfish you sounded? You humiliated us in front of everyone." I closed the door quietly, leaning against it, and looked at him with calm eyes. "I told the truth, Daniel. If the truth humiliates you, that's not my fault." His mouth twisted into a snarl. "You think you're some kind of martyr, don't you? Acting like we've drained you dry. You've always been dramatic. You liked giving. Don't pretend now that you were suffering." The words stabbed deep, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little he had ever seen me. I hadn't liked giving, I had needed to in order to feel worthy of their love, and he had exploited that need every step of the way. "You really believe that, don't you?" I said quietly. "That I existed just to serve you? That my only purpose was to give until I had nothing left?" Daniel's eyes flickered. For a moment, I thought I saw doubt, but then his jaw clenched. "If you cut us off, Margaret, don't expect us to come running when you're old and alone. You'll regret this." I stepped closer, so close he had to lean back slightly. "No, Daniel. I regret every day I spent letting you treat me like a servant, and I will never regret ending it." His face hardened, and without another word he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. But the backlash didn't stop there. It spread like wildfire through the family grapevine. The gossip that had once painted me as selfish now grew darker, more vicious. I was called ungrateful, bitter, heartless. One cousin told others I was mentally unstable. A niece whispered that I must be under the influence of outsiders because I would never have dared stand up to them otherwise. And yet, beneath their venom, I could hear the panic. Because it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about control. For years, I had been the predictable one, the compliant one. They knew I would always say yes. Now that I was unpredictable, they were terrified. And fear makes people cruel. The most painful backlash came from my nephew. He had been quiet during the dinner, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously. A week later, he appeared at my house, tears streaming down his face. "Aunt Margaret, please," he begged, dropping to his knees in my living room. "I'm sorry. I know I've asked too much, but I can't survive without you. I've got debts, people after me. If you don't help, I don't know what I'll do." For a moment, my old instincts surged, the urge to reach for my checkbook to fix it, to save him. But then I remembered every lie, every manipulation, every time he had promised to change, and never did. I knelt in front of him, lifted his chin so he had to meet my eyes, and said softly, "If you don't learn to survive without me, you'll never survive at all." His expression shifted from desperation to anger. "So that's it. You're just going to let me drown?" "No," I whispered. "I'm finally letting you swim." He cursed under his breath, stormed out, and slammed the door. After that, I noticed a change in the air whenever I passed relatives in public. Their smiles were gone, replaced with sneers or tight-lipped glares. Some avoided me entirely, pretending not to see me in the grocery store. Others muttered insults just loud enough for me to hear. The backlash was brutal, but it was also revealing. The more they lashed out, the more I saw the truth: their love had always been conditional. The moment I stopped serving their needs, it vanished. Oddly enough, that realization didn't crush me. It freed me. Because I no longer had to wonder whether they cared. I no longer had to cling to the illusion of love. The backlash stripped everything bare, leaving only the raw, ugly truth. And though it hurt, it also gave me clarity. But clarity wasn't enough. They had spread their lies about me far and wide, painting me as cruel and unstable. If I stayed silent, those lies would become the only story people remembered. So I began planning my response. Not a loud defense, not shouting matches or desperate attempts to reclaim my reputation. No, I would respond the way I always should have, with evidence, with truth, with patience. I gathered my notes, every detail I had written down over the months. I collected receipts, texts, voicemails, anything that proved the pattern of their entitlement. Piece by piece, I built a record so undeniable that no amount of gossip could erase it. And then I waited. Because I knew the backlash was only the middle of the storm, the real reckoning was still to come. And when it did, it wouldn't just silence their lies. It would leave them facing the bitter consequence of everything they had done. If Part 10 was the storm of backlash, Part 11 was where the air finally cleared and I saw with absolute certainty who I was up against and who I had become. The threats, the gossip, the guilt-tripping, none of it shook me anymore. I had spent years being bent under their demands, and for the first time in my life, I stood tall. And it was in this chapter of my life that I truly learned the art of standing my ground. The first confrontation. It began with Linda, of course. My sister had never been one to accept defeat gracefully. She showed up at my house one evening without calling her face a mask of forced serenity. "Margaret," she said, "as soon as I open the door, we need to talk." Privately. I let her in, though every instinct told me to keep her on the porch. She sat on my sofa like it was her throne and folded her hands, rehearsed and self-important. "You've caused a lot of pain lately," she began. "People are talking. The family feels abandoned. But it doesn't have to be this way. You can still fix it. Just admit you overreacted and things can go back to normal." Normal. That word was like acid on my tongue. Normal had meant servitude. Normal had meant silence. I looked at her steadily. "Normal," I repeated. "Do you mean where I pay everyone's bills and no one asks if I'm okay? Or where you dump your children at my door and laugh about it later? Or where I am mocked for not having children but expected to raise yours?" Her face reddened. "That's not what I meant." "Then be clear," I said firmly. "What do you mean by normal?" She faltered, the rehearsed line slipping away. Finally, she snapped, "Fine. You've made your point. But this coldness, it's not you. You're letting bitterness poison you." I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp. "No, Linda. What poisoned me was giving everything and being treated like nothing. Standing up for myself isn't bitterness, it's healing." She stared at me wide-eyed as though she didn't recognize the woman in front of her. And maybe she didn't, because for the first time I wasn't folding under her guilt. When she left that evening, slamming the door, I felt no regret, only relief. Daniel's threats. Daniel, my brother, was less subtle. He believed in control through intimidation. A week after Linda's visit, he cornered me at the grocery store. His face was grim, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. "Margaret?" He growled, "Enough of this nonsense. You've stirred up the whole family with your accusations. Do you want us all to hate you? Because that's where this is heading." I stood by my cart looking at him with measured calm. "If telling the truth makes you hate me, that says more about you than me." His eyes flashed. "You think you're clever, don't you? Acting like you've been mistreated? Do you have any idea how people are laughing at you now? They say you've gone senile, that you don't know what you're talking about." The words stung, but not in the way he intended. I had lived in fear of being dismissed as crazy for so long, but now I had something I'd never had before: evidence. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notebook, the one filled with months of notes. I flipped it open, held it up. "Do you see this? Every word you've said, every request, every manipulation, I've recorded it. If anyone wants to laugh, let them. But the truth is written down, and it doesn't lie." For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. His bravado slipped just for a second. Then he sneered, trying to recover. You wouldn't dare show that to anyone. I smiled faintly. Try me. He muttered something under his breath and stalked away, leaving his groceries behind. And I knew in that moment his threats meant nothing. They had only ever had power because I let them. The nephew's plea. The hardest confrontation came not from my siblings but from my nephew. He was always the most brazen in his demands, but now his desperation had taken on a frantic edge. He came to my house one evening, his eyes red from crying. Aunt Margaret, he whispered, dropping to his knees in front of me. Please, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've asked too much. But I'm begging you just one last time. Help me, and I swear I'll turn my life around. Once those words would have broken me. Once I would have reached for my wallet, convincing myself this would be the time he finally changed. But now I saw through him. His trembling hands, his watery eyes. They weren't repentance. They were performance. I knelt, looked him in the eyes, and said softly, Do you know why you never change? Because no one has ever let you face the cost of your choices. I won't rob you of that chance anymore. He froze, stunned. Then his face twisted into rage. So you'd rather watch me fail? You'd rather see me suffer? No, I said gently. I'd rather see you grow. But you'll never do that if I keep saving you. His fury spilled out, then words like daggers. You're heartless. No wonder you never had children. You don't know how to love anyone. For a moment, pain flared in my chest. But then I realized his words were proof of everything I had said. He didn't see me as a person, only as a resource. And now that resource was cut off, he was lashing out with cruelty. I stood, walked to the door, and opened it. When you're ready to take responsibility for your life, I'll be here. Until then, do not come back. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. I stood in the silence that followed, shaking, tears pricking my eyes. But beneath the pain was something stronger: resolve. Standing firm. From then on, every attempt to break me only made me stronger. They tried everything: guilt, anger, pleading, even spreading more rumors. But I refused to bend. When Linda accused me of being cold, I replied, No, I'm finally warm to myself. When Daniel sneered that I'd die alone, I said, Better alone with peace than surrounded by parasites. When my nephew spat that I was selfish, I answered, Selfishness is giving until you have nothing left and expecting more. That was you, not me. Each response left them stunned, off balance. They didn't know how to fight someone who no longer played by their rules. And slowly I noticed something remarkable: their power over me dissolved. The more I stood firm, the smaller their threats became. Their insults lost their sting. Their demands lost their weight. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. Reflection. Late at night, I would sit by my window looking out at the quiet street and reflect on how far I'd come. There was grief. Yes, grief for the years. Wasted grief for the love I had begged for and never received. But there was also pride. I had faced the storm and I had not broken. I had stood my ground, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. And more than that, I knew this was only the beginning. Because while I had reclaimed my dignity, my relatives had yet to face the true consequence of their greed. That reckoning was coming, and I would be the one to deliver it. The decision to let them face the bitter consequence of their own actions was not born from malice. It was born from clarity. For decades, I had shielded them from responsibility, absorbing the blows of their mistakes, so they could continue living as though life owed them ease. But I realized something fundamental: protecting them had only hurt us all. They had grown entitled, lazy, cruel. And I had grown invisible. So I stepped back completely. I didn't announce it. I didn't issue ultimatums. I simply stopped carrying their burdens. And as I withdrew, their lives began to unravel. Cracks in the facade. The first collapse came from Linda. My sister had always lived beyond her means: new clothes, expensive dinners, little luxuries she justified because Margaret will help if I fall short. Without my safety net, those indulgences turned into debt. One afternoon, I passed by her house and saw a repossession truck in the driveway. Her car, the one she had proudly shown off just 6 months earlier, was being hauled away. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering. Linda stood on the lawn, screaming at the men, her face red with humiliation. I didn't stop to help. I didn't even slow down. I drove past, my heart heavy but resolute. Later that week, she called me, her voice sharp with fury. "This is your fault, Margaret. If you had just helped like before, none of this would have happened." I answered quietly, "No, Linda. This is your fault. And maybe now you'll learn what it means to live within your means." She hung up on me, but I knew the lesson had landed even if she'd never admit it. Daniel's fall. Daniel's downfall came next. He had always enjoyed playing the patriarch, the big brother who held the family together, but only because I financed his role. Without my contributions, the cracks in his finances became public. Bills went unpaid. His credit cards were maxed out. His wife confided to a neighbor, who of course confided to me, that they were behind on their mortgage. The final blow came when his electricity was shut off for 3 days. His children, teenagers with a love of social media, posted videos complaining about living like it's the Stone Age. The humiliation spread quickly. People whispered in church and town, wondering how the mighty Daniel had fallen so low. He called me one evening, his voice tight with restrained rage. "Are you enjoying this, Margaret, watching us suffer?" I took a deep breath before answering. "I don't enjoy your suffering, Daniel, but I won't save you from it. You need to face the reality you've ignored." His silence was long and bitter. Then in a low voice he said, "You'll regret this. You'll die with no one around you." I didn't flinch. Better alone with peace than surrounded by vultures. The nephew's desperation. But the harshest consequence fell on my nephew. For years, I had bankrolled his string of failed ventures, each one more reckless than the last. Without me, he had no fallback. At first, he tried to maintain his bravado, boasting about a new opportunity. But soon, word spread that he had defaulted on a loan. Debt collectors began circling. Friends stopped answering his calls. Even his girlfriend left, unwilling to shoulder the weight of his instability. One evening, I saw him sitting on the curb outside my house, his head in his hands. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. "Aunt Margaret," he whispered, his voice broken. "I don't know what to do. I've lost everything." I sat beside him, my gaze steady. "No, you haven't lost everything. You've lost the illusion that you could live without responsibility. That's not loss, that's clarity." Tears streamed down his face. "But I can't." "You can," I interrupted. "You must, because no one else will do it for you now. Not even me." He looked at me, then truly looked at me, and for the first time I saw something different in his eyes. Not anger, not entitlement, but recognition. Maybe he would change, maybe not, but at least now the possibility existed. The gossip turns. As their lives unraveled, the gossip that had once condemned me shifted. People noticed the pattern. They saw Linda's repossession, Daniel's debts, my nephew's failures, and they remembered how often those same relatives had mocked me. Slowly, whispers began to change. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe they were using her all along. Even the pastor, who had always tread carefully, pulled me aside one Sunday. "I don't know the full story, Margaret, but I see the truth in people's actions. You have carried enough. Let them carry themselves." His words were a balm I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time, the town wasn't looking at me with pity or suspicion. They were looking at me with respect. Broken trust. But the most profound consequence wasn't financial, it was relational. The family that had once banded together in their entitlement now fractured under the weight of scarcity. Without me to fund them, they turned on each other. Linda accused Daniel of not doing enough. Daniel accused Linda of being careless. My nephew blamed them both. At gatherings, their arguments spilled out loud and venomous, shocking even the younger children. What they once projected onto me, selfishness, blame, resentment, they now turned on each other. And I watched quietly as the empire of entitlement I had unknowingly built crumbled into dust. My quiet satisfaction. Did it hurt to see them fall? Yes. Part of me still longed for the family I had dreamed of, the family that loved without condition, that supported without strings. But another part of me knew this was necessary. Without consequence, there is no change. Without loss, there is no growth. One evening, I sat alone on my porch sipping tea and reflected on it all. For so long, I had feared that withdrawing would leave me empty, but instead, it left them empty, and it left me free. Free from the endless cycle of giving without receiving. Free from the humiliation of being mocked in private and used in public. Free from the chains of guilt that had kept me silent for decades. And though I bore the pain of their resentment, I also bore something far more powerful, the knowledge that I had reclaimed myself. Their bitter consequence. The bitter consequence wasn't just repossessed cars, unpaid bills, or broken families. It was the realization that they had destroyed the very bridge they depended on. They had burned me out, mocked me, dismissed me, and in doing so, they had lost the only person who had ever truly been there for them. And now, as they faced their struggles, they were forced to confront the truth. They had no one else to blame but themselves. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to scream. All I needed was to let their actions catch up to them. And they did. One by one, they learned the cost of taking someone for granted. And though they may never admit it, I know they finally understood. When I look back now, it feels like I lived two lives. The first life was defined by giving until I had nothing left, by carrying everyone else's burdens while mine went unnoticed. The second life began the day I said no, the day I decided that my worth was not measured by how much I could sacrifice for ungrateful people. And standing here at the end of that second life's chapter, I can finally breathe. The aftermath. In the months following my withdrawal, the ripple effects continued to spread through my family. Linda, stripped of her financial cushion, downsized her home. Daniel, no longer able to pretend he was the pillar of the family, swallowed his pride and took a second job. My nephew, humbled by his failures, began to seek real work instead of chasing empty schemes. They would never admit it, but my absence forced them to face reality. And though they still whispered about me, still tried to frame me as selfish or cruel, their voices carried less weight now. The truth had revealed itself too clearly for anyone with eyes to ignore. Neighbors who once believed the rumors now looked at me differently. Some offered quiet words of support. Others simply treated me with the kind of respect I had longed for all my life. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that my story wasn't one of bitterness, but of reclaiming dignity. Quiet reflections. I spent more time alone after everything, but it wasn't the lonely solitude I had once feared. It was peaceful. My mornings were mine again. Quiet cups of tea on the porch, the sun warming my face, the birds chirping without interruption. I rediscovered hobbies I had abandoned years ago, reading, gardening, even painting. Small joys, yes, but they were mine. And in that stillness, I realized something profound. I had mistaken being needed for being loved. For decades, I thought their constant demands meant I mattered. But true love doesn't drain, it replenishes. True love doesn't mock, it cherishes. It took losing their false affection to finally understand what real affection should feel like. A letter unsent. One evening, I sat at my desk and began writing a letter. It wasn't meant to be sent. It was a way of putting into words everything I had carried for years. Dear family, I gave you my time, my money, my home, my heart. I gave until I was empty, believing that was what love required. But instead of love, I was met with entitlement. Instead of gratitude, I was met with mockery. You never saw me, not truly. You only saw what I could provide. But now I see myself. I am not your servant. I am not your safety net. I am a woman who deserves respect, dignity, and peace, and I will no longer sacrifice those things for your comfort. If that makes me selfish in your eyes, so be it. Because I would rather be selfish and whole than generous and broken. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it in a drawer. It didn't matter if they ever read it. I had written it for me. The visit. Months later, Linda came to see me. Her pride had been chipped away by debt and exhaustion. She looked smaller somehow, her sharpness dulled. I came to say, she hesitated, her voice unsteady, that maybe you were right. I said nothing, only gestured for her to sit. She continued, eyes fixed on her hands. We took you for granted. I don't know if we'll ever fix that. But I see it now. A strange sadness filled me, not joy, not vindication, but mourning for the years we had lost. I never wanted revenge, Linda, I said softly. I only wanted to be seen, to be loved. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't answer. She simply nodded, stood and left. And I knew then that some wounds never fully heal. My victory. But victory doesn't always look like apologies. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it looks like silence instead of chaos. Solitude instead of servitude. My victory was in reclaiming myself, in proving to them, to the town, to myself, that I was more than what I could give. And though they may never say the words, I know my family learned something too. They learned that you cannot take endlessly without consequence, that love without respect is hollow. That entitlement eventually collapses under its own weight. Their bitter consequence was losing the person who had held them up for so long. My quiet victory was finally learning to hold myself. Final reflections. If there's one thing I would tell anyone listening, it's this: never confuse being needed with being loved. The two can look alike, but they are not the same. One drains you, the other sustains you. One reduces you to a role, the other sees you as a person. I spent too many years mistaking one for the other, but it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to say no. It's never too late to stand tall. It's never too late to reclaim your life. And so my story ends not with a dramatic explosion, but with a steady, quiet strength. I am not the woman they mocked, nor the servant they depended on. I am simply Margaret Hale, a woman who finally chose herself. Closing, fade out. So I'll leave you with this. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been taken for granted until you forgot your own worth, remember my story. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't in shouting or fighting. Sometimes it's in stepping back, letting the world see the truth for itself, and finding peace in your own heart. And if my family ever wonders why I stopped giving, they need only look in the mirror. The bitter consequence was never mine to carry. It was theirs. Have you ever felt taken for granted by your family? Share your story in the comments below. I promise you, you're not alone. And before you go, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories like this one. Because sometimes the truth is the only revenge we need.